Forget the feasts of kings and lavish banquets of nobles. The real story of medieval Europe was told in kitchens no bigger than a stable, where firewood was scarce and meat was a distant luxury. In these humble homes, survival meant ingenuity. Barley replaced wheat. Onions were gold. Meals stretched from yesterday's scraps and whatever grew in the dirt. This isn't the cuisine of castles, it's what kept millions alive. These are the 15 cheap, clever, and often surprising meals that medieval families ate every day, and some are still eaten today. In medieval Europe, hunger was not an anomaly. It was a regular visitor. For the vast majority of the population, food was a daily struggle, not a source of enjoyment. Between the 9th and 15th centuries, over 80% of people lived as peasants or villeins, bound to land owned by nobles or the church. Their survival depended on the weather, the soil, and their ability to stretch the barest resources across long winters and unpredictable harvests. Famine struck frequently. A single failed crop could mean death for thousands. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 offers one of the clearest windows into this reality. Torrential rains wiped out grain fields across northern Europe. Livestock starved or drowned. Salt, critical for preserving meat and fish, was nearly unobtainable. In many villages, people ate the bark off trees or boiled weeds to make bitter broth. Some were reduced to consuming animal hides, and in a few documented cases, even human flesh. Chroniclers like Jean Froissart and the monastic annals from St. Albans recorded starvation on a scale unseen in generations. But famine years were just the extreme, even in relatively stable times. Daily meals for most families were born from necessity. Fields were often too small or infertile to grow surplus. Fertilizer was limited to what animals could produce, and tools were rudimentary. Wooden plows, hand hoes, ox-drawn carts. Crop rotation was poorly understood before the 12th century, and so soil exhaustion was common. Barley, rye, oats, and legumes were more common than wheat, which was too valuable to be eaten regularly by peasants. A medieval peasant's house was little more than a single-room structure, often shared with livestock. The hearth sat at the center, an open fire pit beneath a hole in the roof. This was where all cooking was done. With no ovens and minimal cookware, meals had to be simple: boiled grains, stews, or thick pottage that simmered slowly over the flames. Bread, if it could be afforded, was baked in communal ovens, operated by the lord of the manor, often for a fee or a portion of the loaf. The diet was low in fat, high in carbohydrates, and monotonous. Fresh meat was rare. Most protein came from beans, peas, cheese, or, occasionally, salted fish. By contrast, the nobility ate differently, not only in quantity, but in kind. Their tables featured roasted game, white bread, imported spices, and wines from France or the Mediterranean. They dined in halls surrounded by servants, while peasants ate seated on earth floors, often sharing a single wooden bowl. This divide was not merely economic. It was enforced by law and custom. Sumptuary laws dictated who could eat what, wear what, or drink which type of wine. The food a person consumed was a visible marker of their place in the social hierarchy. Yet within these constraints, medieval families adapted. They made use of every scrap, foraged wild greens, preserved what they could, and developed recipes that turned bland ingredients into filling meals. Their ingenuity kept communities alive through lean winters and thin harvests. Behind each dish was a story of endurance, not of royal kitchens or noble feasts, but of those who fed their children on scraps and faith. These are their meals. In the medieval household, one dish remained nearly universal among the poor. Not a recipe, but a method, an ever-simmering stew of grains, vegetables, and anything else available. It wasn't prepared for flavor. It was made to fill stomachs, stretch ingredients, and survive. Across much of Europe, the hearth never went cold. A cauldron, suspended over open flame or nestled in embers, often remained in use for days. Into it went barley or oats, dried peas or beans, wild greens, onions, leeks, garlic. If a family had access to a bit of fat, a pork rind, or even a cleaned bone, it would be dropped in to enrich the broth. Meat was rare. Bones were reused, sometimes for weeks, until they gave nothing more in England. Barley-based pottage, thickened with root vegetables, was common. In France, chestnuts and lentils often featured during the colder months. In German-speaking regions, cabbages were central, joined by garlic and rye. Season dictated the ingredients. In spring and early summer, wild herbs like sorrel or nettle were added fresh from nearby woods. In late autumn, storage vegetables like turnips or parsnips took over. Salt, when it could be afforded, was used sparingly. Spices, if they appeared at all, came only from trade networks and were generally reserved for the wealthy. The pottage pot served not only as a meal source, but as a practical solution for fuel conservation. Firewood was laborious to gather and often scarce. Keeping a pot on low heat throughout the day, rather than reigniting flames for each meal, conserved energy and simplified cooking. The pot became a permanent fixture in the home, its contents changing, evolving, and building flavor with each addition. Bread, if available, was not served alongside, but used as a thickener or soaked directly in the mixture to soften it. For many households, this dish was eaten at every meal. Breakfast pottage might be thinner, left from the previous day. The evening version, richer if anything new had been added. Children, laborers, and the elderly all relied on the same pot. In monasteries, pottage was frequently served as part of the regulated diet, especially during fasting periods, where meat was prohibited, but grains and legumes offered sustenance. Records from Westminster Abbey show purchases of dried peas and onions in bulk, suggesting large-scale preparation of such meals. Although it varied across regions and centuries, the function of pottage remained consistent: simplicity, economy, survival. Its longevity and the number of lives it sustained is evidenced in court rolls, household accounts, and surviving cookery manuscripts like the Form of Cury from 14th century England. Yet these elite records only hint at the everyday. Versions that left no written trace passed from hearth to hearth. Pottage was not a delicacy. It was the boiling center of a medieval home. What simmered in those pots told the story of the people, not through extravagance, but endurance. In medieval Europe, bread was more than food. It was currency, obligation, and often the line between hunger and starvation. For the poor, wheat, the grain of white bread, was largely out of reach. The fertile fields that produced it were controlled by monasteries, noble estates, and wealthy towns. Its flour was expensive, its consumption symbolic of wealth and status. For peasants and laborers, the daily loaf was rarely white. It was coarse, dark, and dense, made from barley, rye, oats, or whatever grains could be grown or gathered. Barley, in particular, dominated peasant bread. It thrived in poor soils, required less maintenance than wheat, and ripened faster. But its flour lacked the gluten content necessary for soft, airy bread. The result was a heavy, filling loaf, more survival ration than delicacy. In regions with colder climates or poorer soils, like northern England, Scotland, or Scandinavia, oatcakes or flat rye loaves replaced barley bread. Where famine struck, bread could be stretched with acorns, bean flour, or ground roots. These substitutions reflected more than poverty. They marked desperation. In many villages, bread was not baked at home. Most commoners lacked ovens, which were expensive to build and maintain. Instead, households prepared their dough and brought it to communal ovens operated by the local lord, monastery, or manor steward. This was not a charitable service. Fees were imposed, and in many places, peasants were legally bound to use the lord's oven, mill, or press, a practice known as banalites in France. The obligation was enforceable under feudal law. Avoiding it risked punishment or the confiscation of goods once baked. Loaves were often marked to indicate the household or to prevent tampering. In towns, bakers faced scrutiny over weight and purity. England's assize of bread and ale, enforced from the 13th century onward, regulated the price and size of loaves based on the fluctuating cost of grain. Bakers who violated the standard could be pilloried, fined, or banned from trade. Bread also carried social and spiritual meaning. In Christian Europe, it symbolized divine providence and was central to the Eucharist. At the same time, superstition surrounded its preparation and consumption. In some regions, loaves were marked with crosses before baking. Breaking bread with someone could signify peace, trust, or hospitality. Refusing bread was seen as a serious slight. During times of scarcity, accusations of bread theft could provoke violence or expulsion from the village. In written records, from manorial accounts to court rolls, bread appears again and again, as rent in kind, as a measure of sustenance, as the first item listed in famine relief. For the poor, barley bread was not an inferior version of something better. It was the food that kept them alive. Across medieval Europe, legumes were essential to survival. For the poor, they weren't side dishes or supplements. They were the meal. Dried peas, broad beans, lentils, and chickpeas were among the most reliable sources of protein available to those who could not afford meat. These humble crops earned their place on the table not by taste, but by necessity. Grown in common fields, preserved easily, and rich in nutrients, they became staples in stews that sustained laborers through long days in fields, forests, and workshops. By the 12th century, agricultural manuals and monastic records across England, France, and parts of Italy mentioned beans and peas as regular crops. Unlike grains, which required extensive milling and careful storage, legumes were harvested, dried, and stored in sacks or earthen containers for use throughout the year. Their resilience against spoilage made them ideal for regions with short growing seasons or unpredictable weather. Even when wheat failed, beans often survived. In England, split peas were commonly boiled into thick stews, known later as peas. Pottage. Across the continent, regional variations existed. In the Low Countries, fava beans were paired with leeks and herbs. In Catalonia, chickpeas were seasoned with garlic and boiled with bits of lard or leftover broth. German peasant households often relied on lentils, boiled with onions and vinegar for added sharpness. In northern regions where fat was scarce, legumes were mashed and combined with stale bread to stretch their volume. These stews were not eaten for variety. They were prepared repeatedly, often every day, and seasoned with what little was available. Salt, if affordable, wild herbs like sage, parsley, or savory, and occasionally smoked meat or suet, if the household had any to spare. Bones, if on hand, were simmered to lend depth to otherwise plain flavors. In wealthier homes, legumes appeared as part of Lenten meals, when the church banned meat. But for peasants, these stews were everyday fare, not by religious rule, but by economic reality. Nutritionally, legumes played a vital role. Their protein content made them an indispensable substitute for meat, especially in regions where livestock was reserved for the elite or too costly to maintain. Combined with grains like barley or rye, they provided a more complete nutritional profile. Monastic records from Cluny Abbey and Westminster reflect regular rations of peas and beans in the diets of monks and laborers alike. During periods of famine, dried legumes were among the first items stockpiled by manorial authorities for redistribution when available. The physical demands of medieval life required dense, energy-rich food. From sunrise to sundown, peasants toiled in ploughing, harvesting, tending animals, or constructing roads and buildings. Pea and bean stews offered the fuel needed to continue. The bowls were wooden, the spoons shared, but the impact of these meals, silent, repetitive, and overlooked, was immense. They fed not just bodies, but the structure of society that rested on them. In the kitchens of medieval Europe, few ingredients were as indispensable or as humble as the onion, the leek, and the clove of garlic. These weren't luxuries, they were survival tools. In households where meat was scarce and spices unaffordable, it was these pungent vegetables that gave food flavor, substance, and sometimes even the illusion of richness. By the 12th century, leeks had become a core crop in much of Western Europe, particularly in Wales, where they held both culinary and cultural significance. In England and France, onions were harvested and dried to last through winter. Garlic, though more pungent, was common in southern regions and valued for both its taste and medicinal properties. All three were hardy, easy to store, and capable of growing in marginal soil, making them ideal for peasant gardens or small household plots in everyday meals. These aromatics formed the base of the simplest soups and broths. Water was heated over a central hearth, and into it went chopped onions, leeks, or crushed garlic. If available, stale bread was torn into pieces and added as thickener. A handful of herbs, sage, thyme, or parsley might be included when in season. The result was a thin, savory broth that filled the stomach and provided warmth, especially during long winters or fasting days. These soups carried more than sustenance. They reflected the ingenuity of those who prepared them. Without meat, dairy, or grain, flavor had to be coaxed from the few things on hand. The sulfur compounds in onions and garlic deepened as they simmered. Leeks, milder and sweeter, softened into a gentle base. Even a meal this basic could offer comfort. Broths also intersected with medieval medicine. According to humoral theory, the dominant medical system of the time, foods had intrinsic properties that could affect the balance of bodily fluids. Onions and garlic were classified as hot and dry, believed to aid digestion and circulation. Leeks were considered useful for respiratory ailments. As a result, broth recipes were often prescribed by healers or monks, especially in monasteries where culinary and medical knowledge overlapped. Manuscripts like the Tachinum Sanctatus, a medieval health handbook, translated from Arabic, recommended leeks and garlic as preventatives against infection. These soups also reflected fasting customs. On religious fasting days, which could number over 100 per year, meat and animal fats were forbidden. Onion or leek broth, sometimes thickened with peas or lentils, became a go-to substitute. In monasteries such as Cluny or Monte Cassino, records show regular purchases of alliums in bulk, stored for year-round use, while elite households might view such a dish as plain or poor. Among commoners it was a staple, reliable, adaptable, and tied to the rhythms of work, illness, and faith. Nothing was wasted. Even the papery skins of onions might be boiled to color fabrics, and garlic braids hung from ceilings, not just to dry, but to ward off disease. Onion and leek broths weren't celebratory meals. They were what people made when nothing else was available. But across centuries and borders, they endured, not for what they lacked, but for what they gave. In medieval Europe, for families fortunate enough to own a cow, goat, or even limited access to one, dairy provided a rare but critical nutritional advantage. Unlike meat, which required slaughter and preservation, milk offered a renewable source of sustenance. And though fresh milk spoiled quickly, especially without refrigeration, medieval households developed a range of methods to preserve its value. The result was a variety of simple but vital dairy products: buttermilk, soft cheese, curds, and occasionally butter, each used to extend meals, add fat to lean diets, and sustain laboring bodies. Fresh milk, whether from cows, sheep, or goats, began spoiling within hours, if not immediately processed. In most peasant homes, it was consumed quickly or fermented into more durable forms. Buttermilk, the liquid left behind after churning butter, was one such product. Thin and slightly sour, it was often drunk on its own or mixed into porridge and flatbread doughs. Churning itself was labor-intensive and required enough cream to make the effort worthwhile, which meant butter was less common among the poorest. But the byproduct buttermilk remained. Accessible in dairy-producing regions, curds formed naturally when milk was allowed to sour. These clumps of coagulated milk solids were drained and salted to make a fresh, soft cheese. In Northern Europe, these were eaten plain, mixed with herbs, or added to thick soups. In southern areas, especially parts of Italy and the Iberian Peninsula, milk was sometimes heated and curdled with vinegar or rennet, forming panna-like cheeses that could last several days. Cheese-making had ancient roots, but by the Middle Ages, it had evolved into both a household skill and an organized craft. Monasteries, particularly Cistercian and Benedictine orders, maintained detailed records of cheese production and trade. The Abbey of St. Gall in present-day Switzerland and the Abbey of St. Benut-sur-Loire in France, for example, were known for their dairy operations. Among peasants, hard cheeses were rarely made at home. They required specialized tools, aging spaces, and consistent salt. Instead, soft cheeses, cottage-style curds, and sour milk were used quickly and often combined with grains, legumes, or onions to stretch them into meals. Recipes from 14th century English texts, like the Form of Cury, describe milk pottage and cheese loaves intended for lean households. These preparations not only added flavor, but more importantly, calories and fat, scarce commodities in the diet of a field laborer or shepherd. Seasonality shaped the availability of dairy. During spring and summer, when animals produced more milk, surplus was fermented or turned into cheese. In winter, milk yields dropped significantly, and so dairy products became rare. Women typically managed dairy tasks, including milking, churning, and curdling, often passing down skills through generations. In some manorial records, dairymaids are listed by name, a sign of the importance of their labor to estate economies. Dairy offered no luxury. It was practical, perishable, and deeply woven into daily subsistence, whether stirred into gruel, spread on coarse bread, or consumed alone. It filled critical gaps in a diet otherwise dominated by grains and pulses. In regions where crop failure could turn deadly, milk and its derivatives remained a fragile but invaluable safeguard against starvation. Across medieval Europe, gruel and porridge were among the most common meals consumed by the lower classes. These grain-based dishes formed the foundation of everyday sustenance, particularly for breakfast, though in many households they appeared at every meal, simmered slowly over an open hearth. They required minimal equipment and ingredients, often little more than a pot, water, firewood, and whatever grains could be obtained. Their value lay not in variety, but in simplicity and efficiency. Oats were a staple in regions with cooler, wetter climates, such as Scotland, northern England, and parts of Scandinavia. In the drier and more temperate zones of Central and Southern Europe, millet, spelt, and barley took precedence. Buckwheat, introduced to Europe in the later medieval period, gained prominence in Eastern territories, particularly in parts of Poland and Russia. These grains were boiled in water or thin broth, producing a soft, thick consistency that could be adjusted based on need or scarcity. For poor families, these dishes were rarely sweetened. Salt was the most common seasoning when it could be afforded in some households. Fresh herbs, like thyme chives or parsley, were chopped and added for flavor. Honey, if available, transformed porridge into a rare treat, but it was more likely reserved for feast days or given to children and the sick. In coastal regions, dried fish or scraps of salted pork might be stirred in to add substance. More often, however, porridge was entirely vegetarian by necessity, not by choice. Monastic communities consumed similar preparations, particularly during early morning meals before prayer or labor. Manuscript records from the Abbey of Cluny and other Benedictine institutions include references to cooked grain mash served regularly alongside ale or watered wine. For lay people, the consistency of porridge could shift throughout the day, thinner in the morning for quicker preparation, thicker at night to satisfy hunger after work. The monotony of these meals is evident in surviving peasant accounts and ecclesiastical records. Chroniclers rarely mention gruel, unless in the context of charity, hospitals, or famine relief, a reflection of its humble status. Yet, its nutritional role was significant. Grains like oats and barley provided slow release, carbohydrates essential for physical labor. Combined with milk or bits of cheese when available, porridge could support energy levels through hours of plowing, harvesting, or construction. In times of scarcity, gruel became even thinner, sometimes no more than boiled water with a handful of grain. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, many households were forced to stretch their stores to the extreme, producing near-water porridge with bitter herbs or bark shavings. Relief kitchens organized by churches or town councils often distributed gruel to the destitute, served in communal bowls with wooden spoons, though it rarely appears in noble records or royal kitchens. Gruel and porridge fed the majority of Europe's population for centuries. It was the meal of the worker, the mother, the monk, and the child. Not for ceremony or indulgence, but for function. Its presence marked the rhythms of daily life, predictable, repetitive, and essential. By the early Middle Ages, the role of fish in the Christian diet had become not just dietary, but doctrinal. The Church imposed strict fasting rules that forbade the consumption of meat on Fridays during Lent, and on numerous other religious observances throughout the year, amounting to nearly half the calendar. But fish, classified differently from land animals, was permitted. This distinction shaped the food systems of medieval Europe, from monastic kitchens to peasant hearths. Even in inland regions, families adapted. Salted and dried fish became essential commodities. Herring, in particular, was central to this system. By the 12th century, vast herring fisheries had developed in the North Sea and Baltic regions. These fish were caught in enormous numbers during annual migrations, then preserved in brine or smoke and exported across the continent. The town of Scania, in present-day Sweden, hosted one of the largest herring markets in Europe, with fish transported as far as England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. The preserved product, though still expensive, was more accessible than fresh meat. Monastic records and city accounts reveal a structured system of fish distribution. In England, monasteries like those at Westminster and Glastonbury recorded large purchases of salted fish, primarily cod, herring, and eel, for use during fasting periods. Inland towns relied on regular shipments, often regulated by guilds or civic ordinances. The fishmonger profession became a crucial part of urban economies, with regulations governing quality, pricing, and authenticity. For rural peasants, access to preserved fish was limited by cost and distance. Inland villagers often turned to local rivers and ponds. Freshwater fish such as carp, pike, and perch were caught using nets, weirs, or traps in regions controlled by the nobility or the church. Fishing rights were restricted, but some manorial lords permitted tenants to fish on feast days or during religious fasts. Estate rolls from the 13th century frequently list small fish ponds, maintained for this purpose. Preservation techniques were adapted to suit these realities. Smoking sheds appeared in both rural and coastal areas. Brining was practiced on a smaller scale in peasant homes, using wooden barrels and coarse salt. The goal was not delicacy, but endurance, fish that could last for weeks or even months, and serve as the protein source when other foods were restricted. The religious motivation for fish consumption also intersected with seasonal and economic rhythms. Lent, falling in early spring, coincided with one of the leanest times of year for food stores. Preserved fish helped bridge the gap between the end of winter and the first crops of spring. In urban centers like Paris or London, fish stalls were busiest during this period, with prices rising accordingly. Court records from the reign of Edward III mention disputes over fish pricing and accusations of price gouging during Lent. Even among the poorest households, efforts were made to conform, or at least appear to conform, to religious dietary laws. Simple meals of bread, onions, and small portions of fish became typical Friday fare. Where fish was unavailable, exceptions were sometimes granted, though not always officially. The line between necessity and piety blurred by shaping both availability and demand. The Church's dietary restrictions ensured that fish was not merely a dietary choice, but a logistical necessity. Its role in the medieval world reached far beyond nutrition, embedding itself into trade, labor, economy, and daily survival. In the medieval countryside, the forest was more than a boundary or a hunting ground for lords. It was a lifeline. For the poor, for peasant families living at the edge of scarcity, the woods and hedgerows served as a hidden extension of the pantry. Foraging was not seasonal hobby or supplement. It was a year-round necessity, often led by women and children, who passed knowledge through generations, not through books, but through practice, repetition, and survival. Throughout Europe, wild plants played a crucial role in daily diets. Nettles, which thrived in disturbed soils and along field margins, were among the first edible greens to emerge in early spring, when winter stores had dwindled and new crops were weeks away. Boiled into pottage or soup, nettles provided iron, vitamin C, and a bitter sharpness that gave meals a semblance of flavor. Dandelion leaves, chickweed, sorrel, and wild garlic were similarly collected, their culinary and medicinal uses often overlapping. In monastic herbals, like those kept at St. Gallen or Monte Cassino, these plants were described both for nourishment and for treating ailments, ranging from stomach pain to skin infections. Berries were another important seasonal food. Wild strawberries, blackberries, elderberries, and sloes were gathered during summer and autumn, eaten fresh or preserved with honey when possible. In southern regions, wild figs and mulberries also found their way into rural diets. Hazelnuts, abundant in woodland areas, were collected in large quantities and stored through winter. Archaeobotanical finds from medieval settlement layers, including those at York and Lubeck, reveal caches of nutshells, suggesting widespread reliance on this high-fat resource. Mushrooms, though valuable, posed greater risk. Without modern taxonomy, knowledge of safe versus poisonous species was entirely empirical. Mistakes could be fatal. Amanita phalloides, the death cap, closely resembles edible varieties and was responsible for periodic poisonings, sometimes recorded in local manorial rolls or death registers. Families relied on oral tradition and careful observation to avoid such outcomes. In Slavic and Baltic regions, mushroom gathering was more systematized and continues into the modern day as a cultural tradition rooted in medieval practice. Foraging was not always permitted. Under English forest law or similar statutes on the continent, access to royal woods was restricted. Gathering firewood, nuts, or plants in these protected areas could result in fines or corporal punishment. Yet enforcement was uneven. Many lords tolerated small-scale foraging as long as it did not threaten game populations or timber resources. In some regions, customary rights allowed tenants to gather mast, fallen acorns, and beechnuts, especially for feeding pigs. Certain plants now dismissed as weeds once held significant dietary or economic value. Ground elder, often found near monastic ruins, was cultivated for its edible leaves. Good King Henry, a perennial green now rarely seen in gardens, was once a common side dish. Even mugwort, now associated with alternative medicine, was used in soups and two-seasoned fatty meats. The forest offered no guarantees, but for those who knew where and when to look, it delivered calories and nutrients the field could not. Foraging was never just about food. It was about observation, adaptation, and enduring in a system where cultivated land rarely belonged to those who needed it most. In medieval Europe, water was not a guaranteed source of safe hydration. Wells could be contaminated by runoff from latrines, slaughter-yards, or decomposing waste. In towns and villages where waste disposal was primitive and sanitation inconsistent, waterborne illness was a persistent threat. Dysentery and gastrointestinal infections were common, especially in crowded urban areas. As a result, many communities turned to a more reliable liquid, beer, not the strong, intoxicating ale of feasts and festivals. but small beer, a weakly fermented drink with low alcohol content, often between 0.5% and 2%. It was consumed daily by all ages, including children. This beverage was not brewed for recreation, but for survival. The fermentation process killed harmful pathogens present in water, and the grain base provided additional calories. For laborers, burning thousands of calories per day, even a thin beer carried value. Small beer was brewed in homes, taverns, monasteries, and manorial estates. In peasant households, brewing was typically the responsibility of women. It required simple ingredients: water, grain, often barley or oats, and a fermenting agent. Hops, which act as a preservative, were not universally used until the later Middle Ages. Earlier medieval beers relied on a mix of herbs and spices, called grüt, to add flavor and balance sweetness. Brewing was done in batches, often over an open fire, with the final product stored in clay jugs or wooden barrels. It was intended to be consumed quickly, as it spoiled within days. The brewing process also allowed for multiple runnings, successive extractions from the same mash. The first produced stronger ale, usually reserved for guests or special occasions. The second or third running yielded small beer, thinner, less alcoholic, but still palatable. This efficient use of grain ensured nothing was wasted. In some households, the spent grains were even fed to pigs or mixed into bread dough. Across monastic communities, beer was part of the regulated diet. Records from Westminster Abbey and other religious houses show large-scale brewing operations, supplying both the brothers and their guests. The rule of Saint Benedict permitted monks to consume beer instead of wine, particularly in northern Europe where vineyards were scarce. Monastic beer was often of higher quality, and in some cases, stronger, but smaller batches were still brewed for daily use, especially during Lent or fasting periods, when food was restricted. In towns, brewing developed into a professional craft. By the 13th century, cities like London, Ghent, and Cologne had established brewing guilds to oversee production, quality, and trade. Alewives, women who brewed beer for sale, operated openly in many markets. They were regulated by local authorities and subject to inspection. In some places, ale quality was tested publicly, with fines imposed for weak or spoiled product. Small beer was not a luxury. It was nourishment in liquid form, safe, affordable, and essential. For the poor, it accompanied nearly every meal. For children, it was often the only drink available. In the records of ordinary life, it appears again and again, a quiet but constant presence that sustained a population with few other options. In medieval Europe, sweetness was not a daily expectation. It was a fleeting reward tied to season, geography, and fortune. For ordinary families, desserts did not resemble the sugared confections of later centuries. Instead, nature provided its own indulgences: fruit in late summer, nuts in autumn, and honey when it could be found or bartered. Apples were among the most common fruits across temperate zones. Varieties differed widely from modern cultivars. Many were smaller, tartar, and more fibrous. They were eaten fresh during harvest, dried in thin slices for winter use, or pressed into cider, a beverage that became widespread by the 13th century. Pears, plums, and cherries were also cultivated in monastic gardens and village plots, though in fewer quantities. In southern Europe, figs and pomegranates were grown in warmer microclimates, often near monastic complexes or noble estates. Peasant access to these was limited but not impossible, especially during local fairs or religious festivals. Hazelnuts and walnuts ripened in the fall and were widely gathered, stored in baskets, and consumed over the colder months. Their high-fat content made them particularly valuable during seasons when animal products were scarce. Archaeobotanical evidence from medieval middens, including sites in England, France, and the Low Countries, confirms extensive nut consumption. Among rural populations, chestnuts, in regions such as northern Italy and parts of France, formed an entire food culture of their own. Sometimes ground into flour for baking, honey was the only widely available sweetener before cane sugar entered European markets in significant quantities during the later medieval period. Beekeeping, or apiculture, was practiced by both lay people and monastic orders. Hives were kept in wicker skeps or clay vessels. The product was harvested with care, often only once or twice a year, and used sparingly. In towns, honey served as currency, rent, or tribute. In country kitchens, it flavored gruel, sweetened ale, or coated nuts during feast days. Recipes from manuscripts like La Ménagère de Paris and the Form of Curie occasionally mention spiced honey cakes, rare luxuries for common folk. More commonly served in noble households or religious banquets. Seasonal abundance aligned with the rhythms of the church. Fruits and sweets appeared during festivals like Michaelmas or Midsummer, when harvests were underway and food could be shared. Children received small handfuls of dried apples or honey-dipped nuts as rewards. Though simple, these offerings marked occasions of joy in an otherwise restricted diet. Sweetness, in any form, was memorable precisely because it was rare. It required timing, care, and restraint. In a world where most meals were driven by necessity, nature's deserts were fleeting moments of exception, reminders that pleasure, even if brief, could still find its place on the medieval table. In medieval households, with limited tools and scarce ingredients, flatbreads, pancakes, and fry breads emerged as practical solutions to daily hunger. These were not ceremonial dishes, nor were they reserved for special occasions. They were born from necessity, ways to transform basic grain and fat into something portable, filling and quick to prepare over an open flame or hot stone. In the British Isles, oatcakes were a food, particularly in Scotland, northern England, and parts of Ireland. Rolled, or pressed thin, they required no yeast, no oven, and could be cooked on a simple griddle known as a girdle, a round iron plate suspended over a hearth. Oats, easier to cultivate in wet, rocky terrain, became the dominant grain. Where wheat could not thrive, oatcakes served both a staple and travel ration, especially for shepherds and soldiers. Records from English muster rolls and provisioning, lists from the 13th century reference oatcakes among supplies issued to troops and labourers alike. In continental Europe, flatbreads took many forms, depending on local grains. In the German-speaking lands, rye dominated. Flat rye breads, dense and coarse, were baked directly on heated stones or iron plates. In Mediterranean regions, wheat-based flatbreads were more common, often stretched thin and cooked rapidly on clay surfaces. Italy and southern France produced rustic variations that resemble early focaccias, though these were typically confined to areas with access to better milling and olive oil. Fry breads emerged, where small amounts of fat could be spared. Animal lard, goose grease, or, in southern regions, olive oil. Doughs made from barley or wheat flour were pinched off, shaped roughly by hand, and dropped into pans over hearth fires. Quick to cook, these fry breads could be sweetened with honey if available, or served plain. In parts of Eastern Europe, such as Poland and Bohemia. Medieval records mention plaki, early forms of griddle cakes made from buckwheat or rye. What united these variations was their accessibility. They required little fuel, minimal preparation, and no fermentation. Leftover dough from bread making could be repurposed into small cakes, ensuring nothing was wasted. In peasant homes without ovens, these quick breads allowed families to eat warm meals with only a fire, a stone, or a flat piece of iron. These dishes were rarely mentioned in elite cookbooks. Yet archaeological remains, including hearthstones and carbonized food residues, confirm their widespread presence. Their resilience lay in their adaptability. A canvas for scraps, a vessel for beans or onions, a meal on its own in regions. With little surplus and few options, flatbreads and fry cakes kept hunger at bay, not by abundance, but by ingenuity. In the medieval kitchen, nothing was wasted, not by choice, but by necessity. Food scarcity, seasonal shortages, and the labor required to produce. Every bite meant that even the smallest scraps were reused, reworked, and repurposed. This culture of reuse defined how families ate, how meals were prepared, and how survival was maintained across generations. Leftover bread, often stale within a day or two, found second lives in countless forms. Crumbled into pottage to thicken its texture, soaked in broth to create a filling breakfast, layered into dishes to stretch meat or vegetable portions. In the absence of flour or fat, bread acted as a binding agent in dumplings, meatballs, and stuffing. In both peasant households and monastic kitchens, it remained a staple long after it had lost its softness. The practice was not improvisation, it was routine. Pottage, too, was never fixed. It evolved continuously. A pot might simmer for days, with ingredients added or subtracted based on availability. Yesterday's barley and onion stew could be transformed by a handful of herbs, a new vegetable, or the addition of whey from curdled milk. Bones left over from a rare meat meal were boiled again and again to extract every last trace of flavor. Ashes from the hearth were sifted to recover spilled grain. Animal fat skimmed from stews was saved to grease pans or flavored bread. This daily reinvention was more than economy. It was essential. Preservation methods were limited. Without refrigeration, most meals had to be consumed quickly or kept overheat to prevent spoilage. Firewood was valuable, so cooking large batches once and reheating small portions became common. This approach conserved both food and fuel. Waste, when it occurred, carried consequence. A dropped loaf, a spilled bowl, a spoiled pot. These were not inconveniences, they were risks to health and livelihood. In village culture, throwing away food without cause could provoke suspicion or judgment. Monastic rulebooks, like those of the Benedictines, included directives against waste in refectories. Every portion had purpose. Every crumb held value. Innovation in the kitchen was driven not by wealth or luxury, but by repetition and need. Recipes were passed orally, with instructions built around flexibility. Add what you have, use what's left, make do. In noble households, the reuse of roasted meats and sauces gave rise to early forms of layered dishes and custards. In humble homes, soup pots and baking stones witnessed the same ingredients reimagined countless ways. Stretching the pot was not a phrase, it was a practice lived daily, shared by millions across centuries. A silent, continuous effort that fed Europe long before cookbooks recorded its details. In the spring of 1315, the rains began and did not stop. By midsummer, much of northern Europe lay waterlogged. Fields rotted before grain could mature. Hay harvests failed, leaving livestock without winter fodder. Entire communities watched helplessly as stored grain molded, pastures turned to sludge, and food prices climbed beyond reach. This was not a single-year hardship. It marked the beginning of what chroniclers later called the Great Famine, a catastrophe that spanned from 1315 to 1317, with echoes lasting into 1322. The failure was not limited to crops. Roads dissolved into mud, making transport difficult. Salt, vital for preserving meat and fish, became scarce. The price of rye in England more than doubled. In some towns, grain cost 4 to 5 times the norm. Parish registers and manorial records describe entire villages petitioning for food relief or abandoning their homes. In Bruges, bread riots broke out. In parts of Germany, local councils banned the export of grain in desperate attempts to contain inflation. But the scarcity was continental. When the stores ran out, people turned to anything that could pass as food. Tree bark was scraped and boiled into paste. In Scandinavian and Baltic regions, famine bread was made from a mixture of ground lichen, moss, and sawdust. It provided bulk, not nourishment. Weeds once used to supplement meals, nettles, sorrel, wild garlic, became primary ingredients. But even these ran short, as entire populations foraged the same forest edges. In some parts of northern France and the Low Countries, families resorted to boiling shoe leather, softened in water and scraped clean. Contemporary accounts from monastic scribes, like those at the Abbey of St. Bertin, report people dying, not just from starvation, but from the things they tried to eat. Pestilence followed. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, paving the way for dysentery and typhus. Burial pits multiplied. Chroniclers like Jean de Venette and the anonymous authors of English annals wrote of skeletal bodies lying in ditches, abandoned by kin who could no longer afford to bury them. Interne priests recorded the dead not by name, but by mass graves. Even livestock suffered. Without fodder, oxen and horses died in large numbers, crippling agriculture further. Dairy animals perished or produced little, with planting delayed and few animals left to pull ploughs. The spring of 1316 began under a cloud of futility. Monasteries and urban parishes opened emergency kitchens, distributing thin soup and crusts, but demand outstripped supply within weeks. The famine broke only gradually. By 1318, harvests improved, but the damage had been done. Modern estimates suggest 10 to 15% of northern Europe's population perished. The trauma etched itself into law and memory. In many towns, food storage regulations were rewritten. Agricultural calendars were adjusted. Chroniclers stopped calling it a famine and began calling it the famine, definitive and unmatched. It revealed a hard truth of medieval life. Even the smallest disruption, too much rain, too little salt, one failed harvest, could spiral into mass death. When the usual meals disappeared, there were no reserves, no state relief, no global trade to soften the blow. There was only survival, if anything could still be found, in many parts of the world today. Meals that originated in medieval peasant kitchens still appeared, though now reimagined through modern ingredients and culinary technique. The simplicity that once stemmed from necessity now appeals to those seeking tradition, sustainability, or comfort. Porridge, once the daily breakfast of field hands and herders, has endured with little alteration. In Scotland, oats remain the grain of choice. In Scandinavia, Rye and barley still form the base of morning cereals. Across Europe, regional variants like grid, gurt, and gruel survive not as relics, but as staples, consumed by millions. What was once a peasant's energy ration has become a symbol of rustic nourishment. Stews, too, have changed little in form. The slow-cooked pot of legumes, root vegetables, and scraps of preserved meat survives in dishes like French cassolette, Hungarian goulias, and the English hot pot. Each variation reflects regional produce, but all preserve the essence of a single pot meal built to stretch ingredients, preserve flavor, and sustain labor. Flatbreads, once rolled from barley or rye and cooked over open stones, continue as oatcakes in northern Britain, rye crisp bread in Scandinavia, and buckwheat galettes in parts of France. In rural regions of Eastern Europe, simple pan breads still form a large part of daily meals. What was once born from a lack of yeast or ovens is now valued for its texture and minimalism. Dairy remains just as integral. Soft cheeses, curds, and cultured buttermilk appear in markets across Europe. Yogurt-like fermented milks, once made in clay pots, have evolved into supermarket products, but the fermentation process has changed little. In places like the Balkans or Alpine valleys, traditional cheese-making mirrors techniques recorded in 12th century monastic records. Even preserved fish and vegetable broths, once vital to survival during fasting days or famine, are reflected in the modern popularity of pickled herring, miso-based soups, and bone broths. Each recalls the logic of making the most of what was available. Though the context has shifted, the core methods remain. Boiling grains, simmering legumes, flattening dough, fermenting milk. These were not culinary trends, but survival strategies. Techniques refined not in cookbooks, but through repetition, constraint, and resourcefulness. The ingenuity of medieval families was not driven by luxury or choice. It was an answer to hunger, weather, and the demands of labor across centuries. That legacy endures, not in palaces or banquets, but in kitchens, where necessity became tradition.